phrase it that came about in the first place. It was because actually you wanted to be able to negotiate with your rivals and enemies, and not to have the person you sent there to do that be killed. You know? So the whole evolution of diplomacy and the institutions surrounding it as a component of our intercourse with other countries, it actually was built on the idea that we would be talking to people that we disagree with, and maybe even disagree with quite strongly. So I very much support what both of my colleagues on the panel said on that point. Let me now turn to Russia, and I will divide what I'm going to say into three parts. I'll start out rather broad, and I'll get increasingly narrow. First, just talking about Russia and its perspectives on the Middle East. Then I'll move a little bit to Russia and Iran. Then I'll talk about the Iran agreement and the aftermath. I think the first thing to think about in trying to understand Russia's role in the Middle East is that Russia really sees itself and very much wants to be seen as a global great power. You know, and what does it mean to be a global great power? I would argue that one of the first things it means actually is that you need to have significant influence outside of your own immediate neighborhood. Russia certainly does have influence in its immediate neighborhood, not all in favorable ways. Ambassador Hill referred to what's happening in Ukraine right now. But really, to be a global great power, Russia needs to have an important role somewhere else. It would be very difficult for Russia to have that role in Latin America. The United States really, in many respects, dominates the Western Hemisphere. Russia's not in a position to compete with that. It would be very difficult for Russia to have that kind of a role in Asia. China really has a leading role in Asia. Russia has been struggling for 20 years to have that kind of a role in Europe without success, and I think that some of what we're seeing right now is an outgrowth of that long struggle. So the best opportunity really for Russia to have a significant role outside its immediate neighborhood actually is in the Middle East, where, unlike Africa, Russia has a much stronger kind of legacy of involvement by virtue of its Soviet experience there, where they've got established relationships with important players like Iran, like Syria, like others. Second, Russia's got a lot of important economic interests in the region. Some of them relate to global energy markets and oil and gas. Some of them relate to the arms trade, actually the nuclear trade, and of course Russia built or more precisely completed a nuclear reactor that the Germans started building in Iran, and has some ambitions to sell nuclear reactors in a lot of other places across the region. And the arms trade and the nuclear trade I would particularly point to because these are politically important sectors of the Russian economy, and there are only so many places that you can sell Russian weapons and Russian nuclear reactors. And the Middle East is an important market for that. Finally, Russia has a strong interest in stability in the Middle East region. It's adjoining to Russia's own neighborhood. Russia has a particular concern about spillover of extremism. The Russian intelligence services basically acknowledge publicly that there are about 1,500 or maybe 2,000 Chechen fighters in Syria. Just to give one, fighting for ISIL, sorry, to be specific. They're quite concerned about extremism, and it's a government in Moscow that is very supportive of strong governments in the Middle East that will do whatever it takes to contain extremism inside their own borders. And I think that's one of the reasons that they have the relationship with Assad that they do. Looking more narrowly at Russia and Iran, you know, we have in the United States our own perspective on Iran, which is, and there are multiple perspectives, but there are perspectives that are shaped obviously by the American experience in dealing with Iran. Israel, obviously people in Israel have also their perspectives on Iran, shaped by their experience in dealing with Iran. People in Russia, you know, they have a different experience dealing with Iran, and they have a very different perspective than we do in the United States. I would point really to 3 or 4 things here. Iran, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, after the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan, was basically aligned with Russia in its goals in Afghanistan. They were both supporting the Northern Alliance against the Taliban in that environment. And they basically cooperated actually to end a civil war in Tajikistan next to Afghanistan, which involved some of the same parties. So there's a legacy actually of regional cooperation in dealing with security challenges. They also, from Moscow, looking at Iran, you know, if you're thinking about Russia's own challenges in dealing with Islamic extremism and the war in Chechnya, and you know there are 16 million actually Muslims who live in the Russian Federation. From Moscow's perspective, you know, it's not Iran that is trying to promote these ideologies inside Russia and in the other former Soviet countries. They're looking much more to Saudi Arabia and others, actually, as the ones who are doing that. They view Iran from that perspective much more favorably, actually, as a country that's not trying to interfere in Russia, that wasn't supporting the Chechen rebels during the 2 wars. Again, in contrast to some others, where actually leaders of the Chechen rebel groups were kind of openly traveling to some countries to raise money for their operations. So that's another element. At the same time, I would say, you know, they're both governments that are clearly kind of sick and tired of being on the receiving end of American complaints, directives, etc. They both have their grievances and resentments about the U.S.-led international order. Neither of them appreciates what they view as American efforts to kind of isolate them or marginalize them or deny them the roles that they feel that they're entitled to have. And that's certainly something that brings them together in important ways. I don't want to make it sound like there is a Russian-Iranian alliance, because I think their relationship is a lot more complicated than that. There are a variety of disagreements on specific issues. One I would point to, which is very long-standing, is where to draw the boundaries in the Caspian Sea, and whether it's a sea or a lake, and it all comes down in the end to the energy resources that everybody thinks are under the water. So there are some important disagreements there. There are certainly some mutual suspicions and resentments related to, one good example would be Russia's planned sale of S-300 missiles to Iran, which President Dmitry Medvedev blocked in 2009. The Russians had already taken some of the money. The Iranians are, there's still a lawsuit underway related to that. There are a variety of other disagreements. Certainly it's a relationship where there are some similar strategic goals, but I wouldn't really call it an alliance. Moving to the nuclear agreement more specifically, to me as an analyst of Russia and somebody who tries to understand Russia's definitions of its own interests and Russia's perspective, it's interesting that Russia actually chose to support that deal and to follow it all the way through. And I understand many of the reasons that it happened. But one could actually make an argument that Russia was one of the principal beneficiaries of the previous status quo, which I would define very briefly as no war, no peace. And in kind of a no war, no peace environment, on one hand, Russia could avoid the kind of destabilization of the region that might come about through U.S. military operations or Israeli military operations, or someone trying to promote regime change in Iran or something like that. But at the same time, they put themselves, so long as there were ongoing negotiations, into a very central position, where their role on the UN Security Council really mattered, where the Iranians were perhaps dependent on them to a somewhat greater extent for diplomatic and other kinds of support. And where Iran was isolated, and that isolation kind of reinforced the special nature of the connection with Russia. But Russia ultimately, of course, decided to support the outcome that came about, and I think, frankly, while there was a certain strategic logic in pursuing negotiations but never actually getting to an agreement, which is what many people accused them of doing for a long time, that's not something that you can actually do indefinitely. And at a certain point, the negotiations either have to succeed or they have to fail. My assumption would be that the Russian leadership made a decision that it was better for them for the negotiations to succeed. And in that context, I would actually also point out, that there are different perspectives in Moscow about this situation, and there would be one camp of people who would argue, that Russia is having some very serious disagreements with the United States and the West related to Ukraine, and they need to kind of demonstrate a willingness to cooperate on other important issues and not close the door with the West, and this is the way to do it. There would be other people who were arguing, and obviously lost the argument, that the only way really to get attention from the United States and the West is to create all kinds of problems in as many different places as we can, and that would be a good place to start. That view thankfully didn't prevail. At the same time, though, I think the agreement, and here I'll start talking a little bit more about the agreement and the aftermath of the agreement. It does raise some important long-term and even more immediate than long-term questions for Russia. Some of them relate to energy. Oil prices were already low, which is not good for a Russian government that gets about 45% of its federal budget revenue from taxes related to oil production and export. When the price is around $50 instead of around $100 or $110 or whatever, it makes a pretty big difference to the Russian federal budget and actually to the value of the ruble, which tends to be linked to oil prices. There's a question also of Iran's gas resources, and for people in Europe who are interested in buying natural gas in large quantities from places other than Russia, Iran would be one of the most commercially attractive options in terms of building pipelines, and much simpler than many of the other options that have been discussed. There's also a real question about, is Russia going to be able to sustain over time the connection that it's had with Iran and the level of influence that it's had in Iran in a situation when European companies and European governments are certainly quite eager to re-engage with Iran, notwithstanding American reluctance to do that. Our European allies are not nearly so reluctant. But perhaps more important, China is going to be competing very significantly in Iran. And what's going to happen to Russian companies, to Russian banks, to Russian arms sales, to all of these other things, when Europe and China are also very actively involved in Iran. And then I think there's kind of a fundamental question which builds off of that last point. What is it that Iran needs from Russia that it cannot get from someone else? And I think that's a fundamental long-term question that the Russian government is going to have to answer in its own foreign policy. To look a little bit more narrowly at the environment over the next few months and perhaps a couple of years for things to watch for. I mentioned the sale of the S-300s, and this is a surface-to-air anti-aircraft missile system that Russia has been trying to sell to Iran, and Iran has wanted to buy for a long time. Is that sale actually going to happen? My guess would be that it probably does, and that it will take somewhat longer, but not too long. But there are some complicated issues there. I mentioned the lawsuit. The Russians